We're going to call this Jerusalem, and nothing lame is allowed. Oh, snap. Yeah, right. All right, let's go ahead and get started. We're going and get started. If anybody wants to sit at a table, there are empty tables up here. I was told to make that announcement. Okay. So we don't have the microphones, and so I'm going to ask that anyone who wants to contribute to the discussion with comments or questions or whatever, try to keep them short because it's like a lot of long, empty space for anyone watching it live still or watching it recorded. So it's fine. Don't worry about it too much. Just if you're going to make a big, long speech, save it for next week. We'll try to have the microphones next week, okay? So we're talking about translations and about the scriptures. Well, we're talking about the scriptures, and last week we dealt with translations. We're going to talk more about that this week, about translation of the Bible. So we talked about how not only is practically every Bible every Bible that anybody's going to read is a translation, but reading itself is translating it. Even if you had the actual piece of paper that the original authors wrote on, when you read that, you are translating that in your mind. You are translating words into thoughts. You cannot get away from translation. So when we talk to people, or when I deal with people who think that if they could just read it in Greek, then they're not reading a translation, they're not being honest, or intellectually honest, I should say. I think they're being honest. I think they're sincere, but they're not being intellectually honest in the sense that translation, a reading, is in itself translating. So we have to have that understanding, I think, to understand to get what we're talking about. But there was a comment made, and I want to try to address it very quickly today. At the end of last week's discussion, there was a comment made, I think it was by my mother-in-law, that the things that I'm saying makes them wonder how we can trust the Bible that we read. And it's a very legitimate concern. And I understand that what I'm talking about for some is challenging and difficult. But let me give you a real-world example, and let's see how you would handle it, because I've had to deal with this. So this is a real-world example, and let's see how you would handle it if we are not going to say anything that could in any way make somebody doubtful or might make somebody doubtful about the Bible they're reading. So there is a verse in Hebrews, and in English, I'm going to read it to you in English. In English, in the King James translation, it says, "Wherefore we, receiving a kingdom which cannot be moved, let us have grace whereby we may serve God acceptably with reverence and godly fear." So that's the verse in Hebrews. I didn't write down the reference. It's like Hebrews 8, I think, something like that. 12:28. Thank you. So that's the reference. Now, there is a Spanish printing of the Bible, the old version that most of us use in Mexico. And it's made by the United Bible Society, so it's the main printing of the Spanish Bible, and it reads like this: "Wherefore we, receiving a kingdom which cannot be moved, let us approach God with reverence and godly fear." There is a lot of Bibles in Mexico. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of Bibles in Mexico that Hebrews 12:28, was it, Stephen? Hebrews 12:28 is omitting an entire phrase. It's not there. Now, it was not intentional, but it's not there. And there have been people in the churches in Mexico would stand up, read the second one, the one that's missing the phrase, and share or teach or preach from the one that's missing an entire phrase. Now, how do you handle that? Do you tell them that there is something wrong, amiss, in their Bible? No, but there is. There's a whole phrase missing. There's a problem here. It actually changes what it's saying. But there's hundreds of thousands of people who read this Bible and find no problem with it because when you read it in Spanish, it makes perfect sense. There's no indication that you're missing anything. Makes perfect sense with the phrase missing. It just makes the wrong sense. But what if you were to go and say, hey, the printer made a mistake. They omitted a line. It was unintentional. It's not deliberate. They're not trying to deceive, but they made a mistake. Your Bible, you need to write a line in between those lines. You need to fill that in because you're missing a phrase. What if they got saved with that Bible? Aren't you like ruining their faith? Not easy, is it? No, it's not easy. I've had to deal with that exact verse in Spanish with a number of people who have Bibles that read like that. What if that was the only Bible you'd ever seen in your life and everyone around you had only seen that particular printing of the Bible and someone comes and tells you, you're missing a phrase? Yes, it did. In fact, it's called the evil Bible because it said thou shalt kill. Yeah, it omitted not. And the original printer actually spent time in jail for making that mistake. Yeah. The question isn't what it would bother you. The question is, what if it debilitates the faith of a person because you point it out to them? When we talked about it last week and I pointed out to you that many of you did not understand what certain words in your own Bible meant, the reaction was, you're weakening my faith. Let me put it to you this way. Think about it in this way. On a scale of 0 being low to 10 being very high, how confident are you that the Bible is true? Like on a scale of 0 meaning no confidence, 10 complete confidence, where would you put your confidence that the Bible is true? 0 to 10. 10. That's me, 10. I'm 10 also. I've asked some people and they're like 5. I'm like, wow, okay. I'm at 10. Okay, on a scale of 0 to 10, how confident are you that you understand that Bible? 0 to 10. Be honest and be humble. Joseph says 10. Oh, no, I'm sorry. He says 4 or 6. It depends if Madison is correcting him at the moment. What we were talking about last week is the second question, not the first question. The question isn't whether or not there's a problem in your Bible. The question is whether or not you understand it. And there are many, many things you don't understand. You say, which ones? Well, if I knew, right, I would understand them then, and then they would be crossed off the list. That's the problem, is the unknown unknowns. It's when you read it and you think you know what it means, and you don't. You actually are misunderstanding it, thinking you understand it. And there are a lot of those. There's more than those than you would think. In fact, I spoke to a man who had compiled a list of these, and I gave him a couple more he didn't know. For instance, when the prodigal son says that he tried to fill his belly with the husks that the pigs ate, most Americans are thinking of corn husks. That's just what they have in their mind. That's what they draw on the Sunday school lesson when I was a kid. But they didn't have corn. Corn didn't exist, so what was he eating? Well, most people I talk to don't know. You know why I know? Because in Spanish it doesn't say husks. It uses a different word. Algarrobas. They didn't know what that meant. I looked it up, and it had nothing to do with corn. Okay. So that's what we're talking about. So is it damaging to people's faith to point out that there is a legitimate error in the printing of their Bible? Well, it could be. It certainly could be. Somebody could hear that. In fact, I can tell you absolutely it does. But that's a faith that's not built on fact. Are there printing errors in the Bible you're holding right now? A lot of them. A lot of them. Spelling errors, grammar errors, punctuation errors, a lot of them. That shouldn't weaken your faith, but you're going to have a much more complex or nuanced conception or idea of what inerrant means, let's say. Okay. Another thing I wanted to address that we kind of dealt with last week, but I think it's very important, and that's this. You don't have a right to understand the Bible. I think that our ideas of unalienable rights as Americans has in many ways messed up our concepts, our understanding as Christians. And we just think we have a right to understand the Bible. And not only understand it, but easily. Without any effort whatsoever. So I should be able to read the Bible, and whatever it means to me at that moment, even without thinking, that should be good enough, sufficient, and I shouldn't have to engage in any type of effort or study or education. And you think, well, I don't think that. I think more of us think that than we like to admit. For instance, when we make the claim that you don't have to know Greek to understand the Bible, that is the foundation of that claim. That's easy for you to say. How many languages, do you have something? You're waving your hand, okay. Thought you were trying to get my attention. How many languages do you think in the world do not have a Bible? Any ideas? Quite a few. 1,000. Anyone else? Well, there's not 1 million languages. Easy there, boy. No, almost 4,000. There's almost 4,000. That's Wycliffe Bible Translators survey as of October 2020. There are 4,000 languages, almost 4,000 languages in the world that have no portion whatsoever of the scriptures in their language. Now, what do they have to do to be able to read and understand the Bible? They're going to have to learn another language in their lifetime. Wycliffe is translating as fast as they have resources to do. But this is a very time-consuming task. English translations take up to 20 years to complete. English translations, which is the most translated language in the world for Bibles. More Bibles are translated to English than any other language. It is a well-trod path. There's no surprises, and it takes them 20 years to get it. So you're going to go to those people and say, you don't have to learn another language to read the Bible? Really? We tend to take our very particular, very gracious position as English speakers with such an embarrassment of wealth in this matter for granted. And we think it entitles us to a right. You don't have any right whatsoever to understand the Bible. None. It is a tremendous gift that you have a translation in your language. Jesus, and we talked about it last week, but you remember Jesus in Luke pronounces judgment on Jerusalem because he says the Queen of the South came from far away, traveled across the world to acquire wisdom, telling them, right, that they are extremely culpable if they're not willing to even go a little ways to hear something. They thought that they didn't have to put in that kind of effort. You absolutely do. Now, do you personally have to know another language to understand the Bible? I don't think so. But that isn't because there's some doctrinal reason for it, but only because God, for whatever reason, blessed you more than any other person on earth. You shouldn't assume that that's normal or the standard or the status quo, because it isn't. Let's assume that the Bible translation we read is the correct one in every way. That's fine. Let's assume that. How many people in the world do you think have a Bible in their language that matches what you read? The answer is 0. What did you say? The answer is 0. It's 0. Even Bibles that were translated directly from the King James translation are not like it. They don't get it all right. It's not possible. It's not possible. So the grace and the mercy, the tremendous advantage that you have as an English speaker, nobody else has. Some people have it to a degree. We could look at Spanish. They have a number of translations, many of them very good. We could look at Dutch and German and French, and they also do. But we're talking about what? 15, 20 languages? Maybe. And if you hold the translation you read to the extreme that many do, well, then none of them have it. So what would you think they should do if they really, really want to understand the Bible? Well, you would think they need to learn English. Yes, Michaela. That's a great comment. I was actually going to come to that. So the greatest revival in all of human history appears to be China right now. Do you know what Bible they, for the most part, read? Anybody have an idea? They have several Bibles. They have several translations. No? The RV, the Revised Version, Westcott and Hort's translation. They translated the English Revised Version of 1881 into Chinese. That's the Bible they use. All the things that KJVOs don't like about the RV are in the Chinese version that is being read and preached and taught in China right now. That's what they use. It's called the Chinese Union Version, CUV. If you look it up on the internet, you look up CUV, look it up, go to 1 John 5:7, copy the Chinese letters, put it into Google Translate, and see what you get. You don't get what you have in your Bible. Go to any proof text that you want to look at where we try to show that the RV is a bad translation, and copy and paste the Chinese text that's being used in the greatest revival in human history by most accounts, and you're going to get the RV. Do you realize the RV is like the most hated Bible in English by almost everybody? There's like nobody likes it. Not even the real liberal Christians like it. So how's that happening? Should they learn English to know what God's telling them? Or Greek? No. They've revised it. In English? Oh, the RV? No, everything is. It depends what we call publishing now. The whole world has changed, right? It's all published. Wycliffe's Bible is published now, right? Because you have it right here. I have practically, essentially, every Bible translation ever made or devised. You have it. It's all published now, right? People aren't reading it on paper anymore. They're just not. And why would they? I know some people think it's terrible to read the Bible on an iPad or a phone. This is the reason why they kept making handwritten copies of the Bible 200 years after the printing press. People said, well, it was probably because it was cheaper. No, it was extremely more expensive. It's because Christians in those times thought that if the Bible wasn't handwritten, it wasn't a real Bible. Those printed ones, that's nonsense. We want the old paths. And so they had those handwritten ones. We have handwritten copies, manuscripts, that are newer than our printed copies. It's crazy. Well, it's the same theory today. It's like, oh, digital's bad. Got to have that paper Bible. Don't have the paper Bible. I don't have any problem with them, but this ideology is very silly. And I can imagine, you know, when paper came out, people hauling around their wheelbarrow of stone tablets saying, you whippersnappers with your paper Bible, your little roll, you got to have the old paths, got to go back, stay with the old stuff. This is just an ongoing thing. Every generation thinks that of the previous one. And the next generation is going to think we're antiquated with our iPads. Anyways, all Bibles are published. And the CUV is still the most common Bible in China. But the new one is just a revised of it. There is no, quote-unquote, Textus Receptus Bible that has any foothold whatsoever in China. All right? Okay. So you don't have a right to understand anything. Why is it that in every area of our life we have no problem with that concept? Do you need to study math to be an engineer? Yes. Yes. You absolutely do. You have to learn that language if you want to be a... Do you actually have to go to college if you want to be a professor? Yes. We don't have a problem with that. We don't have any problem whatsoever with that. But when it comes to the Bible, we think we should be able to just wake up in the morning, roll over, look at a page, and just know what it means because God just gives it to us. There's an interesting passage dealing with seeking wisdom in Proverbs, and Solomon says, personifying wisdom, he says that wisdom is like a hid treasure that we have to find, and you have to mine for it. You have to dig for it. And then at the end of all that effort, he says, you put out, he says, and God, he says, and for the Lord giveth wisdom. We like to grab the second part. The Lord gives wisdom. That means I don't have to know anything special. I don't have to learn anything special. I don't have to put out any effort because God gives wisdom. That's not the context. The context is you have to dig and work and sweat and really put out some effort because that's how God gives wisdom. All right. Would it be unreasonable if we had to learn a different language to know God? Would that be an unreasonable demand? It wouldn't. I'm not saying that you have to. I'm just saying if it were so, that's not unreasonable. You shouldn't think, oh, forget it. Never mind. If it's not handed to me in my native tongue, in a vocabulary that immediately I understand, then I'm not interested. Joseph. That's right. That's exactly right. That's right. And that's why they traveled the whole world. You know, I say the whole world. The whole world traveled to Jerusalem to acquire this knowledge. It was geographically centered. It was linguistically centered. You didn't get it just anywhere. It is New Testament Christianity that radically transformed that paradigm. And became Christ saying, you go into the world. The world's not going to come to you. That was Old Testament, right? The whole world, all the nations will descend to Jerusalem. That's the Old Testament. The New Testament is the opposite. You go from Jerusalem into all the world. And you're going to take the scriptures and the word of God and the will of God to all the world. They took that to mean translating it to them. They took the gift of tongues as being an indication that they were to, where like Paul says, become all things to all men, not make all men to their things. Mike. Correct. Correct. And on the end I wanted to deal with that. Let's talk about that for a moment now then. And that is, it is completely mistaken to think that the reason there is a misunderstanding related to the Bible is because of translation. This would be let's say the scholarly side of the argument, right? It's like, the reason people don't understand the Bible is because they're reading it in the vulgar languages. Vulgar languages is an old word that means like common languages. English is a vulgar language. It's not Latin, it's not Greek, it's not Hebrew, right? Those are the sacred languages. And we have the professorial types who tell you, well, if you read it in Greek, you'd understand it. That's nonsense. The reason there is misunderstanding regarding the Bible has nothing to do with translation. Nothing. Has to do with complexity. That's what it has to do with. No doubt it is certainly a help to be able to read it in a language you are fluent in. No doubt. But you could be 100% fluent in the language that it was written in, have the actual piece of paper it was written on, and there would be misunderstanding. We already know that's the case. The scriptures point out that it was happening in real time. Peter says in 2 Peter that was already the case. The Bible was already being misunderstood in real time by native speakers. Yes. They had the apostles there to ask every possible advantage that you could have. There's going to be misunderstanding because what they are communicating are things that people do not understand. And to understand something you don't understand is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And there's going to be misunderstandings. And when we think about, well, what language is it in? That's really a bad way of thinking about it. It's like, what language is the Bible you have in your hand right now in? Well, we could say English. But what English? Which English? Well, late or early modern English. Okay, which early modern English? Well, British early modern English. Yeah, and we could just keep granulating that down, narrowing that down, and we realize that even though we all nominally speak the same quote-unquote language, we do not speak the same language. Every one of us uses words differently, understands words differently. People use a word, and it doesn't mean what they think it means, but it means that to them. How likely is it? Let me ask you this, put it this way. Which language do you think the biblical authors communicated in? Do you think they communicated in their language? And I don't mean Greek, I mean what they understood those words to mean? Or do you think they communicated it in the language of their intended audience? How they understood the words? Or did they communicate it in the broader audience? Or in the more broadly historical audience? I don't know. Maybe different in different places. We don't know. So we say, well, then we can't understand it. We can, but it's not going to be easy. And if that discourages you, then you have an entitlement complex. You think you're entitled to understand the Bible with no effort. And you're mistaken. You're not. You have no right to that. All right. Let's move on and talk about why do we need, if we do we and why do we need more translations? Now, typically we think about that from an English-speaking perspective. We're like, there's 600 translations in English, we don't need any more. Well, maybe. But the question has to be contextualized. If not, then we're asking, well, why did we ever need any translations? Wycliffe translated. Why wasn't that good enough? Tyndale translated. Why wasn't it good enough? Geneva translators translated. I mean, at what point do we say, okay, now we don't need any more? Well, I don't know. It seems kind of, self-serving to say we don't need any more English translations. No, maybe we don't. Maybe there's sufficient of them out there. I'm not sure. What are translations? So that asks us, Mike says it depends. I got to remember to repeat it because they can't hear. It depends what you mean by need, and that's exactly right. Mike, we have to ask ourselves, what are translations for? Well, translations are to try to communicate the original text or the original meaning. And generally speaking, you can't do both. Now, if you don't know multiple languages and you haven't done translation, that may not seem intuitive to you. But those of you that do know multiple languages should know you can actually do both. It's kind of like the examples Mike's given physics, right, where you can't know the speed and the location of an electron at the same time. It's kind of like that. You can translate the text, what it says, or you can translate what it means, and it's very difficult to translate both. In fact, it's usually not possible. You have to choose one or the other, or some combination, but you're really sacrificing one to gain the other. But that's what you do with translation. You're trying to communicate the text and the meaning of an original document. That's what you're attempting to do. Into a language that is understood and spoken by a target audience. The moment that language isn't fully understood anymore, then in my opinion, there's room for a translation. This is why they continue to translate the Bible. Now, do we need 600 of them? Probably not, but I don't know. I don't need 600 of them. But, the people in Geneva didn't think we needed one more either. For those that don't know, that would be referring to the King James. That was done after the Geneva Bible. And those that were adherents to the Geneva translation didn't think we needed another one. They thought that was sufficient. There's two things that when we talk about Bible translation on why translations are being made. One is target languages change. And they change dramatically in some cases. Now, the reason for translating the Bible, in short, is to make it understood. The moment it's no longer commonly understood, in my opinion, there's room for translation. No doubt there's room for translation. Now, you can call it revision, but a revision is just translation. There's some nuances there of difference, but there is no real difference. So if I'm translating to you, and then your children no longer speak your language in a way that's fluent or natural, then giving them the Bible in their language is no different than when it was given to you in your language. We read old versions of the Bible and we think, well, that's spiritual speak. No, it wasn't. It was common language. Most Bibles were meant to be read by common people. That's why they were despised by the scholarly types. Do you know what the scholars wanted you to be reading right now? Latin. Do you know what Erasmus was attempting to do when he produced the Textus Receptus? Most people don't know this. People think Erasmus's goal was to put together a Greek New Testament so people could have the original words. It was not. Not even close. How do we know this? Because Erasmus left copious notes of what he was doing and why he was doing them. You can download them from the internet and read them if you are so inclined. What was he doing? He was translating a new Latin Vulgate. That was the main column of text of his New Testament. In fact, it wasn't just him. Stephanus did the same thing, and Beza did the same thing. You know why you have verse numbers today? You should know this because I've harped on it. You have verse numbers because Robert Stephanus wanted to coordinate his Latin Vulgate with his Greek text. He wanted to hook them up, link them together. The Textus Receptus, most editions, was about the Latin Vulgate, not the Greek text. Because they thought you needed to read the Bible in Latin. They did not intend for people to take the Greek column and translate it to German or English. That wasn't the original idea. But non-scholarly types say, if we're translating the Bible, which was what Latin is, why do we stop in Latin? We should just translate it so we can understand it. Isn't that the spirit of the New Testament? Isn't that what Paul basically laid out as a foundation in 1 Corinthians when he says it's better to speak 5 words that the audience can understand than 10,000 words in a language they cannot understand? We should be communicating the gospel in words that can be understood. And I think that means all the way up to what we're reading. I don't know that we want to become the religion, Christianity wants to become the religion that it was in the Dark Ages, where they stood up and read in Latin, because that was the proper word of God. I think the moment that a Bible is not commonly understood, at least its language, I'm not talking about its concepts, but the language in which it's written is no longer commonly understood, there's need for translation. And we're doing it already. It's not as blatant in English-speaking circles, because I don't think English has changed that dramatically yet, but it is blatant in Polish-speaking circles. That's why they made a revision, because they found themselves doing it on the fly already. And I hear in certain English-speaking congregations, or maybe I should say audiences, where it's done that way also. They read a verse and then they tell you what every third or fourth word that isn't commonly understood by that audience, what those words mean. At what point do we get to the place where we're essentially reading in Latin to everybody and telling them what it means? Well, at some point that happens. At some point we got to tell them, like the brothers in Poland had to do, is say, no, that's really not the F word. That's a different word. Let me explain to you what that is. And we say, okay, this has now gone too far. Now, I'm not here promoting any translation or any effort of translation. You just ask, if you were to ask, do we need translations in general? Absolutely. Otherwise, you'd have to learn Greek. Okay, let me give you an example of one other thing. One is target language changes, but so does the understanding of a source language. The Greek of the Bible is not a Greek that is spoken today. In fact, for a long time, nobody knew what it was. They knew it was Greek, but they had no idea what kind it was. They assumed that it was a sacred Greek, they called it, that was invented by God to communicate the New Testament. That was the working assumption amongst Christian scholars at one time in history. Then they realized, where they started coming in with documents and all kinds of literature and letters and all kinds of stuff like that, in that language, that no, that wasn't a sacred language, that was the common language. And so then they renamed it Common Greek. But there's still a lot of lack of understanding as to how that language was used in that time. And as in fact, from the years, let's say from the early 1700s till now, we have found many, many, many more times more literature in that Koine Greek, that common Greek, than we had before the 1700s combined. I mean, they just are finding treasure troves of literature in that language, which gives them more insight into how words are used and what meanings they could have. And so that changes how they see how things should be translated. Now, you may be uncomfortable with that, but at some point you weren't. Do you realize that whoever translated what you're reading did the same thing? They just did a little earlier. And they were correcting misunderstandings of previous translators. Why do you think they did the King James translation? Do you think they just were like retooling the English? That's not what they said they did. They went back to the Greek and back to the Hebrew. Why? Because they had more insight into how those things would be translated. And we have more now. All right. What if we have multiple translations of the same thing? Does that mean there's something wrong there? Because that's usually what happens, right? You can take a bunch of different Bible translations, put them side by side, say, look at here, there's differences. Something's wrong. No, not necessarily. There are legitimate reasons to have different translations of the same text. There are legitimate reasons. Let me give you an example. What if I were to explain the concept of redemption to you in 3 different ways? So I'll give it to you in how I might try to explain it to a child. Sin is like a debt, and Jesus paid your debt so you could be free. So I could explain that to a child. That would be a way of explaining what redemption is. Now, that's not entirely accurate, but it probably would get the point across to a child. If you were a teenager, I might explain it this way. Sin enslaves those who practice it. Jesus paid the ransom and liberated those who believe. Now, that's a little more on the accurate side, but less on the understandable side. And if you were an adult, I would probably try to explain it more in this way. Because of its feebleness, sin co-opted the law to enslave mankind. But Jesus, by his death and with his blood, purchased us from our legal slave master and made us servants of God. Now, that's a much more accurate view of redemption. But some of you right now, I can just see in your eyes, you like the previous one a little better. Is there a place for all 3 of these? We do it all the time. Do it all the time. You have devotions with your children? I doubt you're telling them the 3rd one. You're probably telling them the first one. Is there a place in the world for a translation that is, quote unquote, really dumbed down? Sure. Absolutely. I've talked to people that would be better off reading 5 words that they understood than 10,000 words that were more accurate that they did not understand. Now, I'm not saying that those 5 words are wrong. There is nothing wrong with the first child version I gave you. There's not, in fact, I've heard the gospel preached more like that than I have with the 3rd one. I'm telling you, that is an inaccurate statement. It's a statement you cannot prove in the Bible in those precise words. It's not wrong, it's just inaccurate. Leanne's looking at me very bewildered. Inaccurate and wrong are 2 different things. You want to add something? That's right. Exactly. Exactly. So think of it this way. You're throwing darts. You hit the target. You hit the target. You're not throwing them the wrong way. You hit the target, but you're not hitting the bullseye. Right? And the more closer we get to the bullseye, the more complicated it must get, because this is not a simple thing. Redemption is a very complicated thing. And it's not just about sin is debt. That is way oversimplified. True, in a very vague way, you can stand far enough away from that doctrine that it looks just like that. Sin is debt. But sin actually has no power. It's what we're told. It's powerless. The strength of sin is the law. Our debt is not actually to sin, it's to the law. And what Christ redeemed us from wasn't exactly sin, but it was from the law. That's why it says we're redeemed by the forgiveness of sins. There's an abstract layer there that the simple explanation just doesn't convey. Are the very simple translations of the Bible inaccurate? Absolutely. Absolutely. The Bible in basic English? The Bible in Esperanto? Absolutely. They don't have the vocabulary to be totally accurate. Do they convey properly the truths that people need to hear? Well, maybe. I know some do. Because I do it in real time all the time. When I sit there and talk to somebody about the gospel, I don't quote verses one after another. And if I do quote a verse, I then simplify it into a way they can understand it. So is there some place, is there some use for a Bible that a very uneducated, unlearned person can pick up and read and understand for themselves? There absolutely is a place for that. Is that the Bible that we all who are deeper biblical scholars should go to do deep studies? No, and the translator themselves would tell you they had no intention of it being used that way. They had no ambition that this is a deep Bible study version. There are places for every one of these translations, at least as far as translation is concerned. All right. Let's talk about one other thing, and we need to end. Okay, let me see what I want. I got a whole bunch of these I want to get to. Let's just talk about, stay with translation. Next week we'll talk about some other issues, but let's try to wrap this up on this. So why are there so many translations? The reason is, roughly speaking, is there are a lot of ways of translating something, and none of them is necessarily better than the other. Now, they generally fall on what we would call a spectrum. It's a little disingenuous because it's more like a 3D spectrum. It's not like a straight line. But basically, they fall on a spectrum, and the spectrum goes from being very technical to very paraphrased, or very what they call formal equivalent to very dynamically equivalent. So what do you want from a translation? Well, you want everything. That's true. But what do you practically want, right? Reasonably want. Well, that depends. That depends. A lot of KJV people will say, we want word for word. We don't want none of this paraphrase stuff. Oh, so you don't like that it says God forbid in Romans? Because that's not word for word. That's not even close to word for word. And that's not the only one. I like to pick on that one because it's so obvious and everyone knows it, but there's a lot of them. There is a lot of phrases in the King James translation that are nowhere near word for word. I'm not criticizing it. They all have them. The New American Standard is considered by many people to be the most word for word, and it is not entirely word for word. Daniel Wallace has a whole list of places where it's not word for word. So what do you want? Well, you want some balance, is generally what translations are looking for. And we don't all agree at different contexts or times what balance we're looking for. That's why they're there. That's the main reason why there are so many translations. It's not because of money. It's not because of business. It's not because of copyrights. I know people like to say that. It just isn't true. It doesn't hold up to any type of real scrutiny if you look at those things. The real reason is we look at these translations and we say, is this translation good in this context? And somebody thought, I don't think so. I want to read the Bible to my children, and I want it to sound more story-like. I want to have the Bible that accurately reflects a word-for-word translation so I can do word studies in a translation, which is very, very unusual. It's one reason why I'm not real in favor of word studies, because we're doing word studies in English. And they did not, the King James Bible, in fact, practically any Bible I've ever looked at, does not consistently translate the same original word as the same English word. And there's reasons for that. Right. But then why are we doing word studies? What we're saying is, in Greek, it's not used the same way, so we couldn't really do a word study in Greek. So where's the advantage in English? And it's difficult. But there's those that would want to make it more easy for you as an English speaker to do a word study in your Bible, and so they will be real careful to try to translate one word the same way every time. So you can look at a concordance and really find the same word every time. I think that we ought to do phrase for phrase, thought for thought. There's room for these things. Now, that is not to say that every translation is acceptable or good. That's not the point. The point is that in theory, you are going to have a lot of translations of the Bible in every language. They're just going to exist. And there's nothing evil about that. It's just reality. All right. Next week, we'll talk about some of the objections and some of the reasons why some translations aren't good. And there are some that I think are done poorly. And we'll talk about that. All right? We will take a brief recess, and then we'll start at 5.